I am a neuroscientist. I get to study how the brain functions, and I specifically got into neuroscience through psychology, so I'm really interested in behavior and learning. So first, my position is specifically a postdoctoral associate. So what that means is that I've completed my PhD, and now I'm in a position where I do research in another laboratory. So as a scientist, there's a few different ways that you can develop your career in science, and I'm in what's called academic science. So I work at universities and do basic research. You can also work in industries like the pharmaceutical industry, science writing, biotechs. There's tons of different ways to go into science, and I'm specifically in the university system because I also love teaching. As I mentioned, I got into neuroscience through psychology, and that actually started in high school. When I was a junior, I took AP psychology, and I absolutely loved it. And then we had a chapter on the brain, and I had no idea that you can go into psychology and study neural function. So that really got me started on my path in this career. I really developed my love of science in elementary and high school. And then, as I mentioned, that class got me interested in psychology. So when I went to college, I went to Seton Hall, I majored in psychology. It was really, really great because I was able to work in a few different laboratories. So this, for anybody who's interested in science, I really, really recommend being able to work in laboratories when you're a college student. So my sophomore year, I got into my first laboratory, and I helped on a project looking at vision displacement goggles. So you'd wear these goggles, and they had little prisms that shifted your vision. And we were studying that in the college population in parallel with a study using them for stroke patients who have something called hemispatial neglect. And in that disorder, you don't attend to one side of space. So these prism goggles shift your vision, and we were looking at it as a treatment for hemispatial neglect. Absolutely fell in love with doing research and asking these really important questions and how the brain works and how that interacts with how we perceive our environment. I then, so through all of this, I also should say that I'm first generation college student. So I also kind of didn't understand anything about the boundaries of the path that I should take to get where I want to get. So I was really lucky that I have really, really terrific mentors in college. And through those relationships, I was made aware that I was really interested in something called behavioral neuroscience. So what that means is I'm interested in how organisms behave, but I also really want to get at the very specifics of their neurocircuitry. So with people, it's kind of hard to dig into the brains. You can't just implant things in people's brains. So then I started to work in an animal lab where we studied a ton of different things. And it was a really wonderful opportunity. And then I was aware of all these different options in neuroscience. So once I got towards the end of undergraduate, I actually did a 3+2. So I finished in 5 years and got a BA and an MS. And my master's is in experimental psychology. So really studying how to make good experiments, how to do data analysis. And I think that if you have those fundamentals, you can kind of transition and go into any subfield of science if you have the basics of how to run a really good study. So going to graduate school, it was really difficult for me to choose what I wanted to do. I was really interested in a ton of different topics. And so I applied to a bunch of different kinds of programs. So different universities and different departments kind of have their different specialties. And I ended up going to Rutgers University. And I worked in a lab that studied the neurobiology of smell. I never, ever thought I would study that. I never thought that smell would be important. But my advisor changed my mind, and probably in the news these days, you see something called anosmia and hyposmia. So anosmia being the loss of sense of smell, and it's being discussed with the COVID-19 symptomology. So it's a very, very important thing that people are studying the chemical senses, smell and taste. So I did my PhD at Rutgers University, and my dissertation research was looking at how our expectations about the world interact with how our brain represents the outside world. So if you've ever maybe been having a get-together with your friends and you're drinking Sprite, and then maybe you grab the wrong glass and you accidentally drink water and it tastes strange to you, even though water doesn't usually taste strange to you, that's the kind of thing I'm interested in. How can the same thing out in the world be processed differently in your brain merely based on your expectations? So for my dissertation project, I used smells to study this relationship between how we learn about the world, how we develop expectations, and how our brain then puts those two things together. So that was great. I was really excited about the research. And then it was time for me to graduate after many, 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 many years. And then I applied for postdoctoral associate positions. So the one I'm in now is at Stony Brook University, and I work in a lab that studies taste and making ingestive decisions. So as I mentioned, with my background in psychology, I'm fundamentally really interested in how we learn and how we make decisions and how we anticipate things. And I think that smell and taste are just a very good way to study learning, or an example of learning, right? It's really important for every single organism, people, your pets, rodents, to be able to anticipate food. It's critically important to learn where good food sources are and to be able to make decisions on what's nutritious and what could possibly be dangerous for your body. So I'm now in a lab that studies just that, how our brain learns to anticipate the availability of food, and how we make decisions about what we eat. So it's very exciting. I love it. I have a great boss. And some other things I kind of want to mention. So that was my, I guess, academic trajectory. But I also think that internships were critically important. So when I was an undergraduate, I interned at the Sharing Plow Corporation, which unfortunately no longer exists. It was purchased by Merck. But I did a summer conducting preclinical research for a drug that seeing if it would alleviate depression. It was an incredible opportunity. I learned a ton about the pharmaceutical industry. It was the first time that I was able to just sit for several months and just churn out data, because these companies are so big, they tend to have very, very high throughput. So that was a great experience, especially as an undergraduate. I had an incredible experience. I actually still, 10 years later, keep in touch with a lot of my coworkers, my bosses. It was really great. And even my advisor there wrote me letters of recommendation for graduate school. And then the following summer, I did an internship at Novartis, where instead of doing preclinical research, and maybe I should mention, so preclinical research is what happens before drugs go to their big clinical trials. And this has been in the news a lot now also with all these existing drugs and seeing if they'll work with COVID-19. So the reason everybody's looking at these existing drugs is because they've had years and years and years of data looking at safety. I was at the part before that. So the years before it gets into these clinical trials, just saying, okay, do these compounds maybe have some hope of being useful? So then the following summer, I did my internship at Novartis. And there I was actually on the other side of things. So I was on a clinical trial team doing their clinical communications. So basically all science gets communicated through journal articles or at conferences. And then particularly with pharmaceuticals, they also have to be kind of education material. So we need to teach doctors and the public how they work. So that was less hands-on science and more learning how to edit things and communicate things to the public. Which was great because actually also in college I worked at the radio station, so I became really interested in communication as a skill, and I think it's especially important for scientific communication. But what I learned from that second internship is that I'm not a desk person. I really want to be in the science, not reading about the science. So every time I was reading an article, I was like, oh, maybe they should have done this experiment. It was, but it was really wonderful to have that piece of information. I really think that you don't know what you want to do until you know what you don't want to do. So it was great that I never had that nagging me what these other options could have been. So I had great experiences as an undergraduate research assistant. I had great internship experiences, and I was pretty confident when I went into grad school that I wanted to do exactly what I signed up for. Especially if you want to go get a PhD, it's many, many years investment. And it's unfortunate when you put a few years in and then you realize that it's not what you want to do. So I consider myself very, very lucky that I kind of loaded that. Oh, sorry. No. Hey, down. So I kind of knew what I was getting into, especially when you do some of these kinds of science that take a long time to run an experiment. It can be very draining, but I knew what I signed up for. So I think it was a really big advantage. I can consult my notes for a second. So that's a great question. Did I have to pay to get my PhD? No, I actually got a small stipend. So this is actually kind of a funny story. I had no idea about higher education at all. So one day my roommate was talking about getting her PhD in history, and she turned to me and said, oh, you science people, you're so lucky you get it paid for. This was the first I heard of it. So I Googled it. Said, wow, I can get a free PhD. And I called my mom and said, I think this sounds like a great idea. I was clueless. So in the sciences, you often get support to get your PhD. So this is a little different whether you're in what part of university. So there are different colleges within universities. So during my PhD, I was in the College of Arts and Sciences in a psychology department. Psychology departments have a ton of classes, so we got our support by TAing or teaching courses. So I did not pay for my credits or my tuition, and then I received a small stipend in exchange for teaching. So that's for your academic year, and then depending on what lab you're in, if you're lucky enough to be in a lab that's well funded, my advisor then paid me for the summer. So that's something that I also kind of wish I knew a little bit more about when I was younger, is how funding for laboratories work. So as I mentioned, I'm in academic science, and that means that our labs are within universities. And most of the funding come from grants, either small institution grants or from the government. So your boss writes a grant, hopefully gets funding for a few years, and then that's what my summer pay would come from, and then the university would give me my stipend in exchange for teaching a certain workload during the year. And this is a little different if you're in a medical school. So right now my position is through a medical school. And the funds come from slightly different sources. So there they have center grants to support their students, so they don't have as much of a teaching load as I experienced when I was in graduate school. However, it was really, really, really wonderful to have the belt of teaching so many different courses. I taught statistics, intro psychology, and a special program Rutgers had called Gateway. So for some students who might need more support, they had an extra credit class to go with their introductory courses. I taught some laboratory classes in conditioning and learning. So now, as hopefully in a few years, I might be able to apply for my own job at a university, I have all that experience under my belt.